Morning, everybody. Today we're going to talk about friendship. There was a popular meme some years ago that said that Jesus' greatest miracle was having 12 close friends in his 30s, right? And our culture has often downplayed the significance and the centrality of friendship, and the result has been catastrophic. An epidemic of loneliness that plagues both singles and couples alike. Vivek Murthy, who's the former Surgeon General, he wrote of this loneliness epidemic last year, and he shared a story of a former patient that he had who won the lottery. And after the patient won the lottery, he moved to a small gated community, but he started getting increasingly more isolated, didn't see as many of his close friends, his rhythms of life changed drastically. He started to get higher blood pressure, he developed diabetes, and he told Vivek that winning the lottery was perhaps one of the worst things that ever happened to him. And in this article, Murthy shared his own struggles too. He was too busy, too distracted, started to neglect his own friendships, and loneliness started to chip away at his own sense of self, his own sense of identity too. He shared that 1 out of every 2 Americans is experiencing measurable levels of loneliness, and everyone at some point in their lives experiences a kind of loneliness. Social disconnection has become a national health emergency. Greater levels of anxiety, depression, heart disease, dementia. And Murthy points out that what hunger does for food, loneliness does for our social relationships. It tells us that something is wrong. Something is wrong in our experience. But we've come to accept loneliness as a given feature of modern life. It induces feelings inside of us, feelings of undesirability, fear, anxiety, and it creates this perpetual cycle that just kind of feeds in itself, and we get increasingly more and more isolated, more and more lonely. The social disconnection is one reason for the polarization that we see in our country too, the lack of civic engagement, because it's easier to demonize people. It's easier to be apathetic to people when we don't know them personally. We don't know their stories, their hopes, their struggles, their joys, and their pains. It's very easy to lob grenades over a wall when we don't know who's on the other side of that wall. There's all kinds of reasons for this social disconnection. I'm going to mention 3. Number 1 is the idealization and the idolization of romantic love. We invest more and more into dating. We load so much of our relational expectations into a potential spouse or a significant other. And I think in some ways, our culture has tricked us into believing that that's where we're going to find the most relational fulfillment. But friendship starts to feel more and more like a mere consolation, a plan B when you can't get that romantic love that you've been wanting for your whole life. But the Bible actually elevates friendship love over romantic love. Even Solomon says that the love of David, his best friend, David says that the love of Jonathan, his best friend, is greater than any romantic love he might experience in this world. Even in marriage, it's friendship, not romantic love, that's the primary engine for marital health. And Holly and I, my wife and I, just entered our 15th year of marriage. We just started that. And thank you. I mean, I appreciate that. That's not why I shared that, but I appreciate that. But I want to just confirm, and Holly would agree with this too. In marriage, what the engine of marriage is more than romantic experiences. It's primarily a friendship. It's just ordinary moments that you share together, laughing together, doing chores together, raising kids together. It's far less romantic, much more a friendship than anything else. And that should inform the kinds of partners that we're looking for. More than how can I experience romance with this person, do I want to be friends with this person? If I'm going to spend the rest of my life with them, can I cultivate a friendship with them? So that's the first reason why we've lost so much social connection, the idolization of romantic love. The second reason is the transience and the fragmentation of modern life. In previous generations, people were more likely to stay in one location for generations at a time. And when you don't move around in any place, you're stuck with the people who are around you. And the result is very deep, very thick social relationships all around you. But with the advances of transportation and technology, we've become so much more mobile, perhaps the most mobile society ever in human history. There's advantages to that. We get to move around easily. Our global perspective changes. The world feels like a smaller place. We can pursue all kinds of vocational and educational opportunities, but it often comes at the cost of deep, thick relationships and friendships. I mean, think about, for those of you who are transplants to New York, think about the reasons why you moved to New York in the first place. What was it, to cultivate deep friendship? No, I doubt it. Maybe that's an incidental benefit that you hope to get, but the reason why you probably came here is to pursue some kind of professional or educational opportunity. The third reason why for this social disconnection, these kinds of friendships and relationships they just feel like too much work. It's too burdensome. I don't know if this investment is going to be worth the cost. You know, for those of you who went to college and went away for that experience, it seemed like back then in our kind of late teens, early 20s, if that's when you went to college, there was so much relational capacity to forge these kinds of new friendships. You kind of had this, I have nothing to lose mentality. You know, I'm leaving all the experiences that I was familiar with, and I'm going to open myself to this new world. I want to meet everyone, right? We have more of an openness in our younger years for those of us who are well beyond that stage. But as you get older, life gets busier, it gets more complex, our relational capacity starts to shrink. And friendships start to feel riskier too. The responsibility to be a friend feels too burdensome. And we're not as convinced. Well, we at least try to tell ourselves we don't need friendship like we used to. We also fear making ourselves vulnerable because we've seen that backfire. I mean, we've experienced strife in relationships, and we don't want to expose ourselves to those kinds of friendships again, lest we get hurt in those same ways. The loss of friendship in our day is often not because of some intentional decision on our part to remove that element of our lives. It's often a slow drift. It's an incremental, gradual decay, this loss of connection. 10 years pass by, and we start to wonder, who are my close friends? Do I have anyone by my side who's going to stick with me through thick and thin? Do I have that kind of friend that I can call at any moment, irrespective of what I'm going through? Do I have those kinds of relationships? Do I have anyone I can share the deepest parts of my soul with? I imagine the older you get, the more life you experience. You probably start to ask those kinds of questions. You wonder, who are the friends that I have? What has all my investment into these relationships, what has it amounted to? It's in the face of these kinds of challenges that the book of Philippians offers a different vision of friendship. So I want to talk about the vision of friendship that we see in Philippians in chapter 2, but across the entire book, and also through the whole Bible too. Number one, the first thing we see about friendship is that the bonds are so deep, they're like family. I've got a couple of verses that I'll show up on the screen, but Timothy and Paul, their relationship is like a son and a father. Elsewhere, Paul calls Timothy his brother. The book of Philippians is the only time this person, Epaphroditus, is mentioned. And the reason why he's mentioned is simply because he's a good friend. That's the only reason why he's mentioned. Paul calls him my brother too. And Paul refers to the Philippian church as my brothers and sisters 8 times across the entire book. And maybe you feel like this language of spiritual family, maybe it feels too much, like it feels too intense. I mean, you may have experienced community where it was overly intrusive, people didn't respect your boundaries, and maybe in more egregious cases, people would even take advantage of your vulnerabilities, all in the name of being a kind of spiritual family. But that vision, that's a dysfunctional family at best, or an experience that's cultish at worst. Or for those who've experienced a positive, loving environment in your family of origin, maybe this concept of family is something that you only reserve exclusively for those members of your biological family. And it's hard for you to open yourself in the same ways to other people who are outside of that core circle. But the biblical vision of friendship as family, it's not meant to be heavy-handed. It's not meant to replace your biological family. But the depth of intimacy and loyalty that's cultivated in these kinds of friendships, they should rival the best family experiences that you've had or that you long for. These kinds of relationships should rival the best kinds of families out there in the world. That is the biblical vision of friendship. That's what's possible in friendship. And in a place like New York, where so many of us are away from our biological families, we need that kind of vision, perhaps unlike anyone else in this country. We need that vision of friendship as family. Not a social club, not a cult, not a dysfunctional family, but a gospel-centered family. That's the kind of experience of friendship that I think all of us are longing for, whether we are conscious of it or not. We long for that kind of friendship. For Paul, these connections and loyalties, they run so deep. In the passage, it says that he would experience sorrow upon sorrow if he were to lose Epaphroditus. Sorrow upon... Do you have a friend like that? If they were to move away from New York, you would experience sorrow upon sorrow. We're so used to saying bye to people in New York. Oh, you're going back home, or you're moving abroad, or you're going to that city. Okay, bye. And 10 minutes later, we stop thinking about them, right? But Paul, sorrow upon sorrow, because the friendship is that thick. The relationship that he has cultivated is that deep. So that's the first element of this vision of friendship. The second element is this idea of shared purpose, which is a theme that has come up before. It comes up again. We hear this language that Paul uses in describing Epaphroditus as a coworker, a fellow laborer in the gospel. They have this common goal that they're pursuing together. They don't seek friendship as an end in itself. They have some higher purpose that they're both striving for, and in that process, they become incredibly close as friends. I remember I have this friend who was a close friend, and we went on this short-term missions trip together, kind of like a vision trip to Uganda and Kenya. And we were already close friends, but going on this trip together and kind of sharing our heart for that kind of ministry, learning about God's purposes in the world, our friendship reached new heights of depth and intimacy that we were both surprised by. And our wives are also close friends. When we got back from that trip, we kept bragging to our wives how we were so much closer than our wives were closer, right? That's the kind of depth of friendship that was cultivated through that trip. There's something that happens through those shared experiences that binds you together in a way that just normal experiences of life can't. And short-term mission trips is not a good proxy for normal, regular life. Yeah, most people don't go on these trips, but I think we can have similar kinds of experiences, for example, like in community group. When you start to see your CG as something that you're trying to cultivate together with other people in your group, that becomes a shared purpose that drives you together in your relationships. Or maybe it's volunteering together as a group at something like Father's Heart that we do once a month. Doing something like that together, you'll start to be surprised at the depth of friendship that you start to experience when you do something else together instead of just focusing on each other. If you search for friendship and friendship alone, you may not get what you're looking for. But if you look for a shared purpose, you may discover a friendship that starts to exceed your expectations. There is something about a higher cause that draws you closer together to another person. Paul uses this language of fellow soldier. Have you ever referred to your friends as fellow soldiers? I don't think I ever have, okay? But Paul is very intense. But the reason why he uses that language is because he's mindful that we're living in this spiritual reality with a spiritual war that's being waged between the forces of darkness and the forces of light. In the movie Usual Suspects, one of the taglines is, the greatest trick that the devil has ever pulled is convincing the world that he does not exist. Paul's mindful of the strategies of the forces of darkness in this world, such that he's bound together with his friends as fellow soldiers, because what drives them together is having this common enemy. Their enemy is not conservatives or liberals. Their enemy is the forces of darkness in this world, and they take that threat very seriously. And that's why Paul's referring to Epaphroditus as my fellow soldier, because they're mindful of this spiritual war that is being waged all around them. It's raging all around them. Do you have eyes to see that kind of warfare that's being waged all around you too? Do you see your friends as something that you need if you are to survive in this spiritual battle that we are involved in? The third thing in this vision of friendship, the third element, is incarnational friendships. Incarnational friendships. The book of Philippians, it's meant to be read in one sitting. It's a letter that's written to this church, and the recipients would receive this scroll, and maybe one person would read it from beginning to end, and they're all kind of listening in. But generally, you would read the entire, and maybe you'd go back and read sections to bolster your thinking or answer specific questions that you might have, but it was generally meant to be read in one sitting. And so the passage we talked about 2 weeks ago, Jesus' incarnation, would be front of mind as people are reading through this passage that we just read through. Jesus humbling himself by becoming a human being, taking on the form of a servant, becoming obedient to death on a cross. I think I've got this on a slide too, from the first part of the second chapter. This is still in the foreground as they've come to this passage that we're in today. And what we see in verses 19 to 30, they're echoes and applications from everything that we see here in this passage. You know, it says in the passage today, everyone looks out for their own interests, not for those of Jesus Christ. I mean, that's an idea that flows out of what we just read here. Epaphroditus almost died for the sake of Christ. And that grammatical construction in the original language, it matches the language that we see here too, of Jesus Christ, that Jesus humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death. It's parallel language that Paul is using here to describe what Epaphroditus did. You see, Jesus' incarnation, his forsaking the heavenly throne, coming down as a human being in this world, that becomes the model for friendship. And as one person notes, we go in by going down. We go into these friendships by going down, by humbling ourselves, by prioritizing other people's needs above our own. Let me look at the verses again. Verse 20, Timothy shows genuine concern for the church's welfare, prioritizing their needs above his own. Epaphroditus in verse 26, he longs for all of them in the Philippian church, and he's distressed because they heard that he was sick. He wasn't distressed because of his own illness. He was distressed that they found out that he was sick. And that's how concerned he is for their well-being. He risked his life, like we just read. In verse 28, Paul says he is all the more eager to send him back because when they see him again, Paul's going to be so glad. He's going to be less anxious because they have his fellowship and his companionship once again. That's a glimpse of what it means to be incarnational in these relationships. You go into these relationships by going down, elevating other people's interests and needs above your own. In our context, it may not be as dramatic. It may not be as dramatic. Though during the pandemic, there were all kinds of parallel examples like this, even in our own community, with educators, healthcare workers, literally risking their lives to pour out themselves in service to other people. But in our context, what does that look like? It could mean sacrificing time and energy. It could mean risking awkwardness. We hate being awkward. But that's one way we go in by going down, by risking vulnerability and awkwardness. Incarnational love, this is what we need in our political discourse too. I watched a series of videos from this media group called Jubilee Media. How many of you know about Jubilee? Can you just do a quick show of hands? Jubilee Media. I'm much more hip than I thought I was. I'm in tune with the things that people are watching. Again, Jubilee Media, and yeah, in one video. Well, a series of videos. In one, they had someone who's more politically liberal surrounded by people who are more politically conservative, like 25 people surrounding that person. And in another video, they had someone who was more politically conservative surrounded by 25 people who were more politically liberal. And basically, each person would take a turn sitting in a chair across from them, debating any number of topics. The viability of Donald Trump's candidacy, abortion, gender identity, those kinds of, one by one, they would go just talking about these kinds of issues, debating, and it got super personal, just lobbing all these grenades, just attacking each other, all kinds of ad hominem attacks. I cannot imagine that anyone was convinced by the back and forth that I saw in those videos. You know, if anything, people became more and more entrenched in what they already believed, fueled by the often contentious debating that was taking place right in front of them. You see, what was missing in those conversations, what was missing in that back and forth was real relationships, real trust that was established, humanizing and dignifying the other person to cultivate an environment where civil disagreement can happen and deeper understanding can be fostered. When you start to build genuine friendship with people who think differently than you, it's harder just to start personally attacking them. You start to generate more empathy for why someone else might hold a particular position. But that's what incarnational love starts to do. You lower yourself to go in. You try to understand why someone would vote a certain way, whether left or right, whatever your political persuasion. You want to just understand what pain or struggle have you endured that's leading you to think about this issue in that way. You're driven by empathy and compassion because you see the other person in front of you as a fellow human being, a brother or a sister who is in just as much need of God's grace as all of us are too. What was missing in these conversations that they posted in these videos on YouTube, what was missing was incarnational friendship, going in by going down into other people's experiences, putting ourselves in their shoes, seeing what they see, interpreting the world the same way that they interpret the world. We're all driven by experiences, environments, people. What is it that's forging their sense of this world and how our country should operate? Incarnational love. That's the third aspect. The fourth aspect of this vision of friendship, it's an expression of worship. This kind of relating to other people, this kind of incarnational love, it's an expression of worship. In verse 30, I think I've got this up on a slide too. Verse 30, Paul says that Epaphroditus, he risked his life for the help you could not give. Epaphroditus, he was there in person in the same way that the Philippian church could not be present in an embodied way for the Apostle Paul. That's the kind of help that Epaphroditus was offering Paul that the church could not offer, his physical embodied presence. And that word there, help, that's the same word where we get the word liturgy from. It's kind of strange. Why is he using the word liturgy there to describe the help that he is offering the Apostle Paul? Well, it's because this kind of incarnational love and friendship, cultivating those kinds of relationships by going in, by going down, that's a form of worship to God. It's a form of worship. Liturgy is the order of service that we have in a church. Sometimes when you go to like a more formal high church service, like an Anglican church, the liturgy is much more overt. You know, you've got these responsive readings. You kind of go one by one through that service, certain things that you recite together, sing together. We have our own liturgy too. We start with corporate worship, and then we transition to vision casting announcements, and then the scripture reading, and then the sermon. That's all part of the liturgy. And what Paul is saying, when you love people like this, incarnating yourself like Jesus incarnated himself, that's a form of worship. It's just as spiritual as what's taking place right now. When you relate to someone like that, it's just as spiritual. What happens Monday to Saturday can be just as worshipful as what happens on Sunday morning here at Adelante Studios. It expands our definition and our understanding of what is truly spiritual. It makes it more holistic and comprehensive. And your relationships, that's often the barometer for your spiritual life. The health of your relationships is often the litmus test for how you are actually relating to God and understanding God too. Your relationships. You cannot flourish spiritually unless you understand this vision of friendship. You can't be spiritually mature, however people define that. I'll just use it for the sake of this sentence. You can't be spiritually mature unless you know how to be a good friend. It's perhaps one of the most spiritual things that you can do, being a kind of friend that incarnates the love of Christ, like is modeled for us in the first part of chapter 2. So that is the vision of friendship that Philippians 2 provides. And I want to transition to the last point. How do we get there? How do we cultivate those kinds of friendships? What is the key? What's the key to these kinds of friendships? And I just have 2 points here. Number one, locate yourself. And I got this from Paul Miller, who wrote this book called J-Curve, Dying and Living with Christ in Everyday Life, something like that. Paul Miller, J-Curve. You can look it up. This point is locate yourself in the right story. Locate yourself in the right story. People often talk about this idea of narrative or story that often drives how we find meaning and significance in the life choices that we have and the decisions that we make, right? There's some kind of narrative that we adopt. For example, one prevailing narrative of our culture that I imagine seeps into all of our hearts too is the narrative or the story of the American dream. We arrange our lives according to this story. We study, we work hard. For many of us, our parents sacrificed so we could have the opportunities that they never had. And that becomes the narrative that drives everything that we do. We see this kind of, we're waiting for this crescendo, right? It's just this straight line that as we put in the time, the effort, the resources, our lives are going to look like this. Our net worth is going to look like this. Our satisfaction and fulfillment is just going to look like this. It's a straight line. But what happens if that story doesn't play out the way that we imagine? What starts to happen? We reconsider the story that we've been living by. We get disillusioned. We're disappointed. We start questioning the meaning of life. We wonder about the choices that we've made when it doesn't play out this way. The story that we apply to friendship and relationships, it also maps out in that same way too. That same narrative arc is what we're trying to live into. If I make these decisions to open up my life to people, my experience of friendship and relationship should follow this straight line. I'll get increasingly closer to people. My friendships will get more and more satisfying. We think it's going to follow this arc, just a straight line. Greater degrees of depth and intimacy and joy. I don't know why I put it in the slide. It's just simply a line. I wanted to keep your attention, okay? So multiple ways to make sure you're engaged. This, but also that too, okay? I just want to make sure I'm getting at all your senses, right? But in Philippians chapter 2, verse 5, again, that was the first part that we talked about 2 weeks ago. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as this part is, I think, really fascinating. The way that I got this insight from Paul Miller, but I think I've never noticed this before, but I think it's fascinating how Paul is trying to motivate people to change how they view their relationships. In your relationships you have with one another, have the same mindset as Jesus Christ. Paul doesn't start listing out do's and don'ts. You've got to make sure you have time in your schedule, email that person, don't say this, here's language. He doesn't get into a list of do's and don'ts. He starts to tell a story. He tells the story of Jesus. And I think I've got this too. This is from Paul Miller. He starts to tell a story, right? He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross, right? He's going down. There's the incarnation of love. Therefore, God has exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow. You see how that's a different narrative arc than the one that we just saw. It's not a line, it's a J curve. It dips before it starts to rise. That's the story that we have to adopt if we want to discover true meaning and purpose in our friendships and in our relationships too. We have to track with another story if we are to eventually experience the joy of deep biblical friendship. When we realize that true friendship takes on this kind of curve. We can go to the next slide. When we realize true friendship takes on this J curve, it changes our approach, it changes our posture. Going down that curve can be opening ourselves up to feeling uncomfortable, going to that thing when we just have no energy to do so, risking feeling awkward. That's going down the curve. And it can mean humbling ourselves in conflict resolution, putting someone else's needs above our own. That's going down. It can mean sending that one email to that person, even though you might be afraid of them not responding or being turned off in some way, asking someone out for coffee, even though you might fear rejection. All of that is starting to go down on that J curve. But if we think the story that we're a part of in our relationships, if we think it's just a line, when things start to get hard, when our experience starts to dip, it's going to feel like something is wrong, like we're not on the right path. And I'm not on this right path. There must be something wrong with the choices I'm making. Maybe I need to drop this friend. I need to change this or that, this circumstance I need to escape. But when we realize that the story that will give us the most fulfillment is actually a J curve, when we locate ourselves on this arc, we know something better will be coming. We know there's going to be this upswing. And true friendship, true relationships will start to enter into our experience. But we first have to travel through that pit, that kind of death, before we can start to rise up and experience a kind of resurrection power in our friendships and in our relationships. I often use a lot of, there's so many analogies that you can draw from hiking. And I've probably have given like 17 in the past couple of years. But I've gotten lost a couple times, like with my boys on these hiking trails, because sometimes it's not clear what the path is, and all you have in front of you, you've got to look for these like colored markers that they staple onto trees, and sometimes those trees are like 30 or 40 yards apart. You can't identify them so easily, and it's not a good feeling when you feel lost, especially with 3 young kids and the sun's starting to go down. You start hearing the howling of wolves in the background. It's not a good feeling. But the moment you realize you are back on track, all the anxiety starts to disappear when you realize you are on the right track. And so it is with friendship too. If you think your experience should look like this, you're going to be discombobulated in all kinds of ways. But when you remember the path, actually the journey looks like this. When you're down here, you realize I'm actually still on the path. I'm on the exact path that I need to be. This is exactly what God wants me to experience. This is what it's supposed to feel like. It's supposed to feel like that. It's supposed to be hard before it starts to get better. Before you start to experience the fullness of friendship, the relationships that you have always craved, you've got to go here first. And when you find yourself in the pit, that is exactly where God wants you to be. It's exactly where he wants you to be. That's what it's supposed to feel like. Locate yourself in the right story. The path to that kind of reward, it's never a straight line. Always a J curve. It's always a J curve. Locate yourself. Find the right path. Live into the right kind of narrative for your relationships. Number 2, the second way we can find this friendship, the second key to friendship, receive the friendship of Jesus. Receive the friendship. This is the last point I'm going to close with. Receive the friendship of Jesus. This is the singular friendship that's most worth investing in. What's astounding about this God-man, the one who reigned before the foundations of the entire world, left the majesty of heaven to become a human being, this God-man actually calls you his friend. That's an astounding label. That's an astounding title that he can bestow on you. The creator of the universe calls you his friend. Sometimes we reduce God to some kind of impersonal force, and we forget that he's actually a person. He has feelings. He wants a relationship. In the same way that we pursue friendship with other people, that's how God wants us to pursue friendship with him too. It always begins with vulnerability and honesty. Sometimes you don't feel like it. Sometimes you're afraid. You're apathetic. God just wants you to be honest. You can't have any relationship without honesty that undergirds that relationship. You've got to just be honest with how you feel. God, you feel distant from me, but I know intellectually you call me your friend, but I'm just not experiencing it in a visceral, in a real way. Reveal yourself to me. It's just being honest with where you are. Every relationship has to begin with that kind of vulnerability, just being honest and open about how you feel. We also need to put in the time to, again, as with any kind of friendship, our friendship with Jesus has to have time. We have to invest time into it. God has feelings. He never condemns, but he longs for you to spend that time with him too. I mean, just like your friends in embodied form, when you neglect those friendships, they long to see you. They want you to spend time with them. And so it is with God too. And it's not because he's insecure. He needs our company to make himself feel better about himself. He longs for us because he has so much love that he wants to pour out into us. That's why he wants us to spend that time with him. And this kind of friendship with God also requires two-way communication with God. You have to have communication if you want to cultivate any kind of friendship or relationship. Dallas Willard, he says that when God speaks, he doesn't mumble. When God speaks, he doesn't mumble. You don't have to second guess how God is speaking to you. You don't have to try to decipher the signs all around you to get a sense of what God might be trying to say. You know exactly what he's telling you through his word. And that's the primary way that we hear the voice of God, through his words in the Bible. It can be hard to feel like the Bible can be energized with the very life of Christ when we read it just like a book. But when we remember that this is God's actually he's calling you. He's texting you like, can you just return my calls? Can you just listen to what I have to say? He doesn't want you to turn your back on him. That's what he's trying to do through his word. Are you communicating with God? Just like you are in every other relationship. You're probably a part of like 7 different text groups on Kakao and WhatsApp to maintain these connections with all kinds of... Are you maintaining that kind of connection with God through his word? That's the two-way communication that has to be present for any relationship to be cultivated. Jesus is this one friend that we always have. It doesn't matter who else that we have. It doesn't really matter when we have Jesus as this unconditional friend who will be there for us in every circumstance of our lives. There are moments when, and all of you probably have experiences like this too. You're going through something and it feels like nobody can understand. It feels like even when you try to talk to your friends about it, it doesn't feel like they fully relate. They don't speak the words that you want them to speak. It can feel disappointing. I felt that too. It doesn't feel like anyone understands the challenges that I'm going through. But God is that one friend who knows, he always knows exactly what you're going through. When you look at the life of Jesus, he was abandoned, he was isolated, he struggled with all kinds of things. When you just read the Gospels and see the life that he lived, he's experienced exactly what you have experienced too. And he offers his friendship to you. He's waiting for you to just pick up that call, answer that message that he's sending you through his word. He wants to cultivate that kind of friendship. There have been times when I feel like the only consolation I can get from anyone is just through God and his word. And there's moments, it doesn't always happen, but there will be moments when you read the word of God, Jesus speaking his words as a friend to you, and it will give you a consolation and a comfort that no other human being can give you. Have you opened up yourself to hearing what he has to tell you? What he wants to tell you that's going to speak very specifically to what you're going through right now. He wants to be that kind of friend to you. I'll close with just this last quote. There's an author named Sophia Lee. She wrote this article in Christianity Today called Confessions of a Loner, where she just kind of traces her experience of expectation, disillusionment, and then rediscovering what this kind of vision of friendship looks like in the church. And this is what she says. She's quoting someone else and including some of her own thoughts too. But she says, as church-going Americans, we have been socialized to believe that our individual fulfillment and our personal relationship with God are more important than any connection we might have with our fellow human beings, whether in the home or in the church. Hellerman wrote, someone that she's quoting. We have, in a most subtle and insidious way, been conformed to this world. The New Testament picture of the church as a family flies in the face of our individualistic cultural orientation, he writes. God's vision of the church as our first family offers a powerful antidote to the social ills of today. One of the most spiritual things that you can do is to be the kind of friend that you would want others to be to you. Do you hear that call on your relationships today? Can we pray together? More than hearing this heavy burden, this call to this kind of vision of friendship, more than it being burdensome as if it all depends on you, the first thing that we can do is receive the friendship of Jesus Christ. Have you received his tender care, his listening ear, his timely words? Have you grown in that kind of friendship with Jesus? Or does he remain some kind of abstract, impersonal concept to you? Ask God in this moment to awaken you to the kind of friendship that Jesus first offers to you. And it's when you start to feel that kind of friendship with Jesus, that's what will give you the power to in turn offer a similar kind of friendship to other people too. Take a moment to receive that kind of friendship from Jesus.